Great.
6:20. So
Cool.
welcome everyone to again, I think it's the third or fourth Peter Ingles Avalanche Education Fund chat. This new format on Zoom is been new to us this year, but we're embracing it. And folks like Sarah Carpenter up in Wyoming is really crushing this new Zoom program where her and the American Avalanche Institute has been implementing a ton of content online, which is really amazing, and kind of helped us kind of ask her to speak with us for this chat. So American Avalanche Institute, they offer a plethora of avalanche education through now online, but in person. They do the professional and recreational courses. They do canine courses too, right?
Yeah.
And they've been in operation for 12 years. Sarah actually was my instructor years ago. I forget when it was, but with a professional course. And so Sarah and I have known each other for years. Sarah teaches numerous courses over the course of a winter, which is awesome. She gives her heart and soul into education, avalanche education. And we were talking how much snow Jackson has compared to Telluride, and Jackson has over double of what's on the ground in Telluride. So if anyone wants to move out of this community, go ahead and just move up to Jackson. They got plenty of room.
Oh yeah. Really easy house.
I'm kicking people out. I'm just kidding. And a couple of little points when we were chatting earlier, Sarah just wanted to preface, and she's probably going to talk about this, but yeah, knowing about the snow and knowing about avalanches and the weather and everything is super important. But what's more important is communication with your partners and your partner dynamics. And so I wanted to just pitch that off to Sarah, and thanks, Sarah, for being a part of this Zoom chat. And I'm going to pass it off to you.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to jump into sharing my screen. If folks have questions while I'm presenting, feel free to dump them in the chat. And that way we can get to them. We'll definitely have some time for questions. And let's see, here we go. I'll share my screen real quick. All right. Let's get this going. Great. And so the title of my talk for tonight is Developing Competence in an Ever-Changing Environment. And I think that, all of us who are backcountry skiing or riding or snowmobiling navigate this ever-changing complex environment. And, this year has been one of the deadliest years in terms of avalanche accidents. And so I want to take a little bit of time to talk to everyone, whether you're brand new to the backcountry and you've never spent any time, or you're just learning this year, or you're the 20-year veteran and have spent a ton of time in the backcountry. How do we continue to learn, and what are ways that we can foster that learning within our partnerships? Because I think that's really important. And the hurdle that we face with backcountry travel, as I think about it, is we travel in a complex, dynamic environment. Today, for me in the backcountry, was exactly this. I started out this morning, it was maybe 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit. I started out in a puffy jacket, skinned up, and by the end of the day, we were skiing through roller balls and wet snow, and folks were skinning in just base layers. Our temperature went way up to somewhere around 30 degrees. Our snow conditions changed, our avalanche conditions changed. And sometimes this complex dynamic environment is really obvious, like today, and sometimes it's more subtle. But traveling in the backcountry, you're traveling through this really complex dynamic environment. And we also just get really poor feedback. We don't always know when we've walked up to the line or when we've crossed the line and we're actually traveling in a really dangerous situation. You don't get that direct feedback that we're making a mistake. And it's high stakes. As we've seen this year, there have been a ton of accidents. We have lost a lot of people from our community. And, it's this environment is not always a forgiving one. And so really where we operate is we operate in a wicked learning environment. We don't get good feedback. We don't get the feedback as to whether we were really good that day or we were just lucky, as opposed to a kind learning environment. For example, bowling. So if you go bowling and you step up to the lane and you throw a ball and it goes in the gutter, you immediately know that you need to make an adjustment, that you're not doing something right. And that's the feedback that we don't get when we're backcountry skiing. Sometimes we just get away with stuff. But when we're bowling, we know we did well or we didn't do well, and we need to make an adjustment. And so I think a lot about it as comparing chess and poker. I read this amazing book a year or two ago. It's called Thinking in Bets. It's by a woman named Annie Duke. She was a professional poker player. And she talked a lot about comparing chess and poker. And she said, basically, with chess, all the information is on the table, all the pieces are there. And so if someone beats you, they're just better, or that they saw the moves that you might not have seen. Versus if you're playing poker, you're making decisions with incomplete information. You don't know what the other players have in their hand, and that what they have in their hand is actually constantly changing, potentially depending on the game you're playing. And it can be really high stakes, right? So you're making these complex, high stakes decisions with incomplete information. And I think that when I read this book, I was like, oh my gosh, this is backcountry travel. Like, we're making decisions with incomplete information. We don't know where the weakest part of the snow is. We don't have all of the information, and yet we're making these high stakes decisions. And so when I think about how do I apply this, when I think about the world of snow and avalanches, the tools that I want are, how do I recognize those times where I've got the really good hand? Those times where I can actually go ski those big lines and it's totally appropriate. And the forecasters are saying, hey, we have low hazard, and we truly have low hazard. How do you recognize that? And then how do you recognize the times where your hand is so-so? It's okay, but it's definitely not the time to go big. And then how do you recognize those hands that are bad, where you need to take 3 or 5 or 6 or 8 steps back? And I think having that understanding is really important. And I want to talk about how to bring this into conversations with partners. And then I also want to think about, how do I recognize the times where I'm operating with wide margins versus narrow margins? And when I think about operating with margins, I think about, do I have a room to make a mistake and have that mistake not kill me, or do I not? And so there are times in the backcountry where you're operating in a wide margin situation, where if you get avalanche, the avalanche is so small, it's just going to bury you to your knees. It's not going to kill you. And then there's times where you're in really committing no fall terrain where you have very little margin. And sometimes it's totally appropriate to be there, but being able to recognize that is also really important. And being able to put that into words with your partners is important. And so when I think about tools for how to build competence, I think about 3 things. And I broke it down, and I think there's a ton of these, but I broke it down into 3 different things. One, I think one useful tool in terms of building competence and building conversation within a partnership is the vocabulary and language around risk. And I'm going to introduce it and expand on that. I think building a culture of communication within a partnership is really important, or within a community. Doing these events is amazing for fostering that culture of communication. And then I think it's also really important to build systems for reflection and learning into your daily practice or into your weekly practice, however often you're traveling in the backcountry. So let's dig into these 3 categories, and let's start with vocabulary and the language around risk. And first up, I just want to give us a few definitions. One is hazard and one is risk. And the definition of hazard, as we're going to use it, is an agent that has potential to cause harm. And then the definition of risk, basically what risk is it measures the likelihood of harm from a hazard. So something or someone is at risk by being exposed to a hazard. And so when I think about hazard, I think about avalanche hazard. And in this case, we use hazard and danger synonymously. So when we're talking about avalanche hazard, we're talking about this danger scale. And when I think about the danger scale, we've got these five ratings, right? We've got anything from low to extreme. And the cool thing is the forecasters have spent a ton of time not just giving these words low to extreme, but they actually branched out and tried to give you more of a definition as to what considerable really means. And they talk about the likelihood of avalanches and where you're going to find them and how big they are and what travel advice they have for that rating. And so when you're looking at the forecast in the future, don't just look at the word, because I don't know about you all, but for me, the word considerable doesn't have deep meaning unless I actually read these definitions, and then it means a lot more. And I always love, there's a forecaster for Utah, that Tom Kimbrough, that always said, well, would you go into a bar if you had a considerable chance of ending up in a fight? And I thought that was really useful in terms of that considerable definition. But anyway, we talk about hazard, we talk about danger in this case. And then when we talk about risk, we're talking about the probability of loss or the probability of gain, right? You don't go into risky situations without potentially gaining something. And when we talk about risk, we're going to talk about the likelihood of something happening times the consequence of that thing happening. And the other piece in terms of having vocabulary around snow and avalanches is understanding the avalanche problems. And the Avalanche Forecast Center does a great job of talking about the problems of the day that they are concerned about. And the reason that this is an important vocabulary piece is that some of these avalanche problems are more manageable than others. Some of them are easier to predict where they might occur, and some of them are just scarier than others. So understanding what dragon you're dealing with every day is really important. So let's put it all together. When the forecasters are putting out a forecast for the day, or when the ski patrollers are looking at the mountain and how to manage the hazard, this is how they're doing it. This is what they're starting with. Their conversation goes from, what type of avalanche problem do we have for the day? Is it a storm slab problem? Is it a persistent slab problem? What type of problem do we have? And then where is that problem found? What elevations, what aspects? And then thinking about that avalanche problem and where it is, they're going to then decide, how sensitive is it to triggers? Are we seeing widespread skier triggers? Is it going naturally? You all had a big natural cycle a couple of weeks ago. That hazard must have gone way up at that point, right? So how sensitive is this avalanche problem to triggers? And then how widely distributed is this problem? Is this avalanche problem everywhere? All aspects, all elevations? It's a much bigger problem, right? Versus, is it spotty, or is it in just specific areas? And combining those, you end up with the likelihood of avalanches. How likely are you to trigger an avalanche for the day? And then down on the bottom, we talked about consequences, right? And what we use as a substitute, and it's not a perfect substitute, but we use the destructive size of an avalanche. And basically, the bigger the number, the bigger the avalanche. But these numbers, they go from 1 to 5, and it's a logarithmic scale. So D2 to D3 is not just a little step, it's a massive step. You go from being able to bury a person to being able to damage cars. You go up to train cars, to changing the whole forest. So these change quite dramatically. Using this conceptual model of avalanche hazard, you get a chart a little bit like this. You've got on the left-hand side, on the vertical axis, you've got your likelihood of triggering, your probability of something happening. And on the bottom, you've got the size of the avalanche. So we've got our likelihood, we've got our consequence, and then we've got our hazard ratings all across this scale. And so if I have an avalanche problem that is likely to be triggered, but it's not big enough to bury a person, it's a D1 or a D1.5, maybe in spots it's a D2, this might be where it falls. Moderate hazard rating, but it's likely to be triggered, but it might be a small avalanche. This is what I think of when I think of storm slab avalanche problems often. I might also have an avalanche problem that's very unlikely to trigger, but it's going to be massive. And in that case, you're moving more potentially into the considerable hazard, depending on what it is. But this is sort of how this all works and overlays. And so let's dig a little deeper into the vocabulary. We talk about risk, likelihood of something happening, the probability of loss or the probability of gain. We talk about the likelihood of something happening and the consequence. But remember that in order to have risk, we have to have something or someone at risk, right? And so the hazard, the avalanche hazard, might just exist out in the mountains until we put something or someone in that, within that environment. So in this case, being the kind wife that I am, I put my husband at risk. And when I think about evaluating how vulnerable his level of risk, I also need to factor in vulnerability and exposure to the hazard. So let's talk about these four pieces. When we think about the likelihood of something happening, or we talk about likelihood or probability, if you're an engineer, you operate in a world where you either have a 0, it's impossible, it is not going to happen, or you have a 1 or 100%, meaning it absolutely will happen. It's certain. Now, I don't know about you all, but most of the time in my life, and definitely in the world of backcountry travel, I operate between 0 and 1. It's really hard to have absolute certainty. So we exist in this level of uncertainty. But being able to have a conversation on how likely something is to happen is really important. Because if I'm unlikely to see avalanches for the day, I might choose to travel in much higher consequence committing exposed terrain. Versus if I'm certain to see avalanches or almost certain to see avalanches, my terrain selection, where I choose to go, is going to look really different. I'm going to avoid avalanche terrain because I don't want to get avalanched by something like this. So that's my likelihood. How likely is something going to happen? Is it closer to the certain or closer to the impossible? And then the consequence is just the impact of something happening. What happens if? If I get caught in an avalanche above these cliffs, what happens to me? Is this survivable or not survivable? That's the question I ask whenever I'm getting ready to travel through avalanche terrain. What is the consequence if I get caught in an avalanche here? And then when I think about vulnerability, this person, if they are climbing ice and they're worried about an icefall hazard from up above, if they are climbing ice unroped, they are 100% vulnerable to the hazard. If ice comes off from up above, it hits them in the head and they pitch off, and that's it, right? You can change your vulnerability in this case by adding a rope. We can change our vulnerability in winter driving by using snow tires and wearing a seatbelt and driving slower. There's ways that we can change our vulnerability. You can add a rope. Sometimes you can add an airbag, a helmet. All of these things can change your vulnerability. And then there's exposure, and exposure is the gas pedal of risk. Are you right in the middle of the avalanche path and the only way you can ski this is center punched it and you are fully exposed if something happens? Or can you ski the edge of this terrain? Or to change your exposure, can you choose lower angle terrain where you're much less exposed to avalanche hazard? If you're thinking about investing, you can change your exposure by diversifying your investments and not just having all of your money in one stock. So that's where exposure plays in. So if we think about this and put it together in terms of your forecast center, I grabbed a random forecast from January from your forecast center. In this day, it was considerable at upper and mid elevations and moderate at low elevations. And the two avalanche problems, one was a storm slab avalanche problem on most aspects except southerlies. And the likelihood of triggering an avalanche was likely, and the size of it was small. And my second avalanche problem was a persistent slab problem. And I know you all see this problem quite a bit where you are, but persistent slab problems always cause me to just take a step back in terms of my terrain choice. So I've got a persistent slab problem, all elevations, northwest to southeast aspects. It's possible to trigger, and it's between small and large. And so if I map this out on that same format, I have a storm slab problem that's likely to trigger in somewhere around D2 avalanches. I probably could have moved it a little to the left there. And then I've got a persistent slab problem that is possible to trigger, and I go from small to large avalanches. So I'm moving into a little bit bigger avalanche. And so it makes sense that we've got that considerable to moderate rating. Now, if I think about risk with this, my overall level of risk is really different if that day I choose to travel in terrain like this versus this, right? If I choose to travel in terrain like this, my vulnerability to an avalanche happening and my exposure to the terrain, I am 100% exposed in this sense. And I'm vulnerable in terms of I am skiing in really steep terrain, I'm not roped, um, and this is high consequence terrain. So my overall risk level in terms of choosing this terrain is way higher. It's the same day, it's the same avalanche forecast. My risk level is different here as opposed to going and skiing lower angle terrain. And so if you think about your risk conversation and your risk level every day as you go out, think about how vulnerable you are to that avalanche hazard for the day and how exposed you are depending on what terrain you're in. That's the conversation that I like to have with my partners, and having this verbiage is really helpful. And the other thing that I would insert into this vocabulary, especially given this year, is what's our season history? Do we have a season history that lends itself to a really reactive or just even a reactive persistent slab problem? Is this a season history that the forecasters are saying, man, you should be scared? Holy smokes, this is different. Or have you had a season where it starts snowing in November and then it pretty much doesn't stop for the season and you have a much stronger snowpack? And that might also dictate some of your terrain choices, but ask this piece as well. And this to me has been a really important conversation, especially, the number of fatalities that we've seen this year can be in part contributed to such a weak snowpack in so many places this year. We've had a really weak season history in terms of in Utah and in Colorado and in Montana. So ask this question as well. So we talk about vocabulary. You've got some definitions, you've got some hopefully new terminology or reviewed terminology to use in terms of conversations. And then let's talk about how do you build a culture around communication and risk management for your partners or for whoever you work with. And one of the things that I've talked to a lot of friends who work in the industry about, one of the things that Annie Duke in her book, Thinking in Bets, talks about is building a culture of dissent and one in which every voice matters. And so finding people that you can work with that are willing to question decisions, but in a way that it's not, malicious, not harsh. Things that I do when I'm out in the backcountry, whether I'm working or just touring with partners, is the first question I ask people is, what am I missing? Here's what I'm seeing. What am I missing? Or if I'm touring with less experienced people, I might actually ask them what their observations are, what their assessment of the terrain is. And then I might also, after that, pipe in with anything that maybe they missed, because then I can do a mentorship. And then for me, whenever I travel with different partners, the lowest common denominator voice wins. And I think that always comes off weird, but really what I mean is the most conservative voice is the voice that I always go with. And having that agreement is really important in terms of building a partnership. So think about how you communicate with your partners and how do you give everyone a voice? And then figure out how to train communication. And this is one of these things that we borrowed from the airline industry, because in the 70s, they had a series of crashes that they couldn't attribute to mechanical failures. They found that there were communication breakdowns within the cockpit. And so the airline industry tore apart what their current structure was and rebuilt it and focused a lot on training communication. And challenges that you can see in the workplace, challenges that you can see in your partnerships in the backcountry with your touring partners. Sometimes there is a hierarchy, and sometimes there are personalities that don't really gel all that well together. And then also sometimes, depending on what the snowpack is, or depending on what the workload is, you can see changes in morale over time. You can get lower morale, which leads to poor communication. And you can also see people just get tired. Having good, solid communication and a system for training communication via something like crew resource management, the benefits are it builds situational awareness, and self-awareness. And basically what the airline industry found is, some of these breakdowns in communication, it was basically that someone, oftentimes the pilot who was in charge, simply lost their situational awareness. And if you have trained communication within a team, you're building in redundancy where even if you lose situational awareness, you have a partner that has maintained situational awareness and can then communicate it. And that, in terms of a true definition of a team, is exactly what you want. Good, solid communication and ways to communicate easily can also facilitate problem solving and really good decision making. It can foster teamwork and leadership, and obviously lead to clearer, more consistent, simpler communication. And so this might sound really simple, but one of the things that we've put in place in the avalanche industry, at least, with folks that I work with, and what the airline industry has put in place, is this 5-step assertive statement process. And I'm going to give you the steps, and then I'll give you an example. And hopefully you don't totally roll your eyes. You basically want an attention getter. You need to state, I have a concern, state the problem as you see it, offer a solution, and then ask for buy-in. And the amazing thing about this, it sounds really simple, but you are now critiquing or commenting on the situation and not the person. So you're focusing on what is right rather than who is right. So this sounds like this. Hey, Sarah, hold up. It's my attention getter. I have a concern. The slope you're about to ski cut looks wind loaded, and sorry, my screen is blocking, and firm. I don't think that ski cutting is appropriate today. It might break further back than you are now. Let's back off and ski the trees today where it's more protected. Are you seeing something else here? And the beauty of this communication, instead of like, hey, you idiot, what are you doing? You still get someone's attention and you shift the situation immediately. There's not time for holding hands. This is designed for those high risk, high consequence, short time frame situations. And so you can debrief all of this in the parking lot, but having a system to get someone's attention before they jump into a start zone that you're not comfortable with is really important. And so this is what I've trained a lot in terms of in a professional environment, as well as with my ski partners. How do I get their attention and comment on what is right and not comment on if they are right or if I am right? So the other thing that I have really pushed for, and that I again took away from this Thinking in Bets book, is adjusting how I measure the success of a day. Because if I asked you, which day were there bad decisions made, just simply by looking at these pictures, if it was me a year or two ago, I would have looked at the middle picture and said, well, someone triggered an avalanche in the middle, so clearly bad decisions were made on that day. But if you take it out of the world of snow and avalanches and say you're driving through town at night, the light turns red and you run it, did you make a good decision? Or did you just have a good outcome? And I would argue that you made a bad decision, but you had a good outcome. Versus if the light turns green and you start going and then someone hits you, did you make a good decision then? And did you have a bad outcome, or did you make a bad decision? Right? If you are following the rules, you probably made a good decision, but you had a bad outcome. And so what I would urge folks to do is shift your conversation, move it from critiquing and commenting and having a conversation around your decision-making quality, and shift it away from the outcome quality. Just because you found amazing snow one day doesn't necessarily mean that you made great decisions that day. So try and shift that conversation, because that's the way that we get to learn and continue to improve as backcountry travelers. And I think that leads directly into that third bubble that I had, is building in systems for reflection and learning. And one of my best friends, every time I ski with her, at the end of the day, she asks, were we good or were we lucky? And I think that simple question can be really helpful. What we at AAI have done is we've turned that "were we good or were we lucky" question into 5 questions around a debrief. In this post-trip discussion, our goal is that you ask these questions after every single tour. Because like we said at the beginning of this presentation, the world of snow and avalanches is a wicked learning environment. And the environment that you operate in isn't going to always give you good feedback. And so if you're not getting good feedback from the environment, then you should try and get good feedback from your partners and from having conversations. And so the questions that we ask are, did we make any bad decisions today? Did we manage terrain well? Are there any improvements there? Did our conditions match the forecast? Do we have any concerns for future tours? And what observations should we send to the forecast center? And this is really meant to be a pause at the end of the day and a learning opportunity. The military uses something similar. They call it an after action review. This is another way to do the exact same thing. Were we good or were we lucky? In this case, what did we intend to accomplish and what was our strategy for the day or for the mission or for the trip? What did we do? Did we follow that strategy? How did we actually execute relative to our strategy? Why did things go that way? What was the difference between what we did and what we thought we would do? And then how do we adapt for future missions or for future adventures? Sometimes this works better for folks. Sometimes our debrief questions work better for folks. Sometimes the question, were we good or were we lucky, works better. But the thing I would push is for everyone to just spend 5 minutes reflecting with partners in the parking lot after a day in the backcountry, because that's how we get to learn. The other thing that as a professional we do, or I do most days, is I fill out morning and evening forms. And you don't, as a recreationist, need to fill out all these forms, but the goal of them is that I have a hypothesis. So what our forms do is this first page is basically filling in weather data. What are the temperatures? What have the winds done? How much snow did we get? Has there been recent avalanche activity? And what's the weather going to do for the day? Is it going to change the avalanche hazard or not? The second page of our morning form looks like this. It's basically identifying those avalanche problems, going through that conceptual model of avalanche hazard that the forecasters are doing every day. Am I worried about persistent slab avalanches? Am I worried about wet slab avalanches? Am I worried about storm slab avalanches? Where am I going to find them? How sensitive do I think they're going to be? How big are they going to be? And then what we do is write out what we think the avalanche hazard is at different elevations and different aspects. And then we cross-check it against the forecast center. Obviously, this is like with a lot of practice, but the main goal is actually just to have an opinion. And then the third page is basically we identify what our hazards are for the day. They can be those avalanche problems. They could also be, I'm going with a new group, I'm going into new terrain, and then how are we going to manage those hazards? But the number one goal is that I go out into the field with an opinion. I have a starting point for my assessment. And then at the end of the day, I come back in and I'm like, well, what did I actually see? These are the avalanche problems I actually saw, and this is how sensitive they are. And then there's some questions on the back. And again, it's that question of what did I think we'd see? And then what did we actually see? And this is an amazing way to learn as well. So really going back to the whole thing in terms of building competence, I think having a vocabulary around risk is really important. And so hopefully through this talk, you have more of a grasp in terms of talking about the likelihood, the consequence, the vulnerability, and the exposure of someone that exists within a hazard. I think building a culture around communication is really important. And so whether you're in a professional environment or a recreational environment, having a way to communicate with your partners, whether it's always easy, shouldn't matter, but being able to communicate in times of crisis is really important. So building that from the ground up is essential. Build in a culture of dissent, build in a place where everyone has a voice, build in a situation where it's okay if someone's nervous and they voice it, that gets supported. And then building in systems for reflection and learning. because, folks take avalanche courses, but you might have a year or 5 or 10 years between your avalanche courses. You need to figure out a way on how to learn when you're traveling in the backcountry, or traveling out of bounds at the ski area, that are outside of formal education. So build in that system of reflection and learning. And really what I would argue is where we really truly build competence is where those three overlap. That is truly where we're hitting the sweet spot of building this culture of growth and learning around risk. And, I applaud you all in terms of the Pi Foundation putting on these talks, because I do think this is a part of your community that is fostering that growth and fostering building competence. Hopefully that talk is helpful. That is what I have for you all this evening. And I don't know if anyone has any questions or additions.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. That was awesome. It's always good to hear you speak and shed some light on traveling in the backcountry and having clear communication and having systems and repetitious type of programs, and it's something that we have talked over the years, or even this winter, of trying to think of you and your partners as your organization. I mean, those of us that are speaking out here, really, we come from, we do personal backcountry tours, but we also work in structured avalanche terrain with other professionals and everything. And we try to just preface that we do have these processes, and we go through these every day, and they help us make good decisions, and debrief and checking if the forecast was accurate or not in the morning, or making some good questions from each day. And so even though most of us out there are just recreationists, but thinking of it as a serious professional maneuver that you're doing out there, and you need to take it serious, and having those upfront conversations with your partners, so you can move forward safely and making good decisions. So let's see, we are getting a couple questions, and we also have John Tuckman on as we're emceeing this for Sarah. And so John, please speak up too, but I'm not reading this question, but maybe you are.
I have a question that I want to ask before we get to Tyler's question here. Well, I have two actually. First off, we had a question about the book you referenced at the beginning. Was that called Thinking in Bets?
Yes.
Annie Duke.
Annie Duke. Yeah,
There
it's
you
a great book.
My question is, and this is something I think we're going to, this is something we talk about from time to time, certainly in Colorado, but how do you think about especially like on a debrief side of things, how do you think about a low probability, high consequence regime? When, obviously when you're touring and you're planning, you're going to operate with a very wide margin of safety. But, when it comes to like debriefing and trying to think about, okay, what did we do right today? What did we expose ourselves to that we didn't really mean to? How do you think about it? Is basically a high level of uncertainty.
Yeah, I mean, I think one piece of those low likelihood, high consequence situations is, before going out, understanding the risk tolerance of your group, because I think some groups have higher tolerance towards exposure of those. And then the question that I like to ask is just, where did I feel most vulnerable today? Is the one thing that I can learn. But I think, you all in your snowpack operate in a much higher uncertainty environment than we do up here. And so I think what you're saying is like, building wider margins is important. And I think the hardest thing about building wide margins is that sometimes your patience wears out. And so that's the piece that I think about, is like, I think it has to be a really disciplined approach every day. And I think, I think sometimes we end up with message fatigue, right? Of all winter long, Colorado and Utah and Montana have been just banging on the table going, it's scary. We have a really weak snowpack. This is scary. And, I've been talking to a lot of friends about how do we build in, like, how do we as a community learn more patience? And I don't have a perfect answer at all. But I think just continuing to ask, like, where did we feel exposed? How exposed were we? Is one piece of it. I don't know if that answered that question, but yeah.
No, that's great. And there's a couple questions in the Q&A here. One is about the worksheets that you were using. And he asked, do you employ a checklist akin to the airline industry while evaluating hazards during?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, so AAI has a checklist. I'll try and pull it up in just a minute. We have a backcountry checklist where the front side of it is basically tour planning. And so we'll identify the avalanche, if there's been any avalanche activity in the last 48 hours, what the weather's doing, what the hazard is, what the avalanche problems are, and then basically tour plan. So that's the front side of the checklist. All happens, in the comfort of your home, in your slippers. And then on the back side of the checklist, there's 5 questions. Well, the back side's actually on this. Let's see if I can share my screen again. The back side, I can, sorry, it's just going to take me a second here. There we go. Here's the backside of our checklist. And this is basically, this upper part is what you do in the field. So our goal is every time you're looking at avalanche terrain or considering entering, the question is, this is a conversation that happens like cyclically during the day. Hey, is this terrain consistent with our pre-trip plan? Are we staying true to what we said we would? Have we seen any signs of instability? What's the likelihood and the size of an avalanche? What are the consequences of getting avalanched in this terrain? And are we going to go into this terrain or not go? And then once that decision is made, the next questions we like to ask is, do we have any concerns with our plan? Are there weird human factors influencing us with this plan? If there is anything like this, then choose simpler terrain. And then what's our plan? How are we gonna move through this terrain? What's our spacing? What's our communication? What's our safe zone? So this is, it's a pocket-sized checklist, and I am a firm believer of using this. I think I got caught in an avalanche, and I think had I had this checklist, I never would have, because it was all based on communication issues.
Awesome. And there's another question here that's in reference to the Wilson Glade incident in Utah, but it's pertinent to our local backcountry and side country. What do you think protocols for good comms with other groups should be in the field?
I mean, I think you all have been on the leading edge in terms of implementing the radio, the community radio project. I think the first thing that I would say is, like, keep in mind that terrain is the one lever that you as a backcountry traveler can pull. And so I think first and foremost, making sure that you're in terrain that's appropriate for the day and for the avalanche problem is essential. And so knowing if you are in that, ideally everyone's wearing radios and communicating, but sometimes it's not like that. And so again, recognizing avalanche terrain is essential. I wish I had a silver bullet in terms of great communication. When I see people in similar areas, we'll definitely foster a conversation saying, hey, our plan is to ski this. Are you all thinking the same thing? And if so, can you wait? Can we use the radio? Recently in the Tetons, there was 2 groups that got to this one couloir at the exact same time. And they decided that they would just text each other when one party was clear, so that then the other party can drop down and ski the couloir. So it's tricky with the Wilson Glades, like neither party knew that the other party was there. And so, you know, sometimes you get lots of radio chatter on your radios. And so it might be worth piping in and saying like, hey, is there someone else in this zone? But I wish I had a perfect answer for that. I think it's just, you know, being as open to communicating with other parties as you can be, and remembering that everyone's out there to have a good day, is important. Yeah, it was a tragic accident, and hard because neither party knew that the other one was there. So.
Yeah, thanks for commenting on that. Yeah, the accidents this year have been kind of tough. They've been a numerous incidents where people are avalanched on the hike up, and you don't necessarily think of even communicating or radioing when you're hiking up. You kind of, you know, put it in your head when you're thinking about descending something. But that just prefaces what Sarah's saying, that you know, if you think you're going to avalanche something and you need to talk to someone on a radio, maybe you should take a big step back, and you know, and if you're thinking you're going to actually avalanche anything, or in avalanche terrain or underneath avalanche terrain, and the hazard indicates that there is that danger, then giving yourself a big wide margin and just not being there.
Yeah.
So ideally, you wouldn't have to use radio.
Yeah, and this, you know, especially ascending, there's not always ways to be out of avalanche terrain when you go up. So I don't want to, like, by no means am I saying like everyone should always walk up outside of avalanche terrain. But if you can, by all means, pick a route that is out of avalanche terrain as you're ascending, because it takes so long and your skis are in lock mode. So you're attached to them and you're just more exposed. So yeah, that terrain issue is tricky.
Mm-hmm.
But well, and it's also when you have other parties out there, it's an issue of exposure and situational awareness, right? If you know there are other parties out there, it gives you a sense of what you may or may be exposed to in terms of other people. But I've like, when I think about our side country and stuff, the element of kind of your uncertainty about other parties around you needs to be part of your decision-making process. That is, what awareness of the situation might I be lacking here in regards to other people being in the zone?
Yeah, I mean, it goes to like part of, you know, it goes to your margins, right?
Yeah.
How many people do I think I'm exposed to? How confident am I in that someone's not going to avalanche me?
And can I talk to them, you know?
Yeah, and can I communicate with them? Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm going to post, we do have a blog post about our backcountry checklist on our website. So I'm going to post the link for everyone to see if you're interested. You know, and if folks want a copy of that checklist, send us a note. It's basically for people with experience. It's not a beginner's tool, but we're happy to share it with people. So.
Great. Well, thanks, Sarah. We did get one more question, but I don't necessarily understand that. John, can you read that and extrapolate anything? Oh, okay.
Pre-trip list gets shortcutted.
Yeah,
I'm not totally clear on that question.
Maybe I'm just interpreting this, but like trade routes, like I'm guessing like, you know, I'm just going to use our example here. Like, you know, the hazard's been high. Everyone's really reeled it in a lot in our community, and they are going up the same skin track every day. And I guess like the pre-trip list or the during the day kind of checklist might get thrown to the wayside. I guess just my 2 cents on this is, as an old mentor always tells me, like, get off that trade route skin track and start poking in on untouched terrain, seeing if you get collapses, doing little side cuts on things. You do have to pull your head up out of that skin track grind and start pulling out and gathering information on your way up, regardless if it's a trade route or regardless if there's 10 tracks on the slope that morning, because whatever. But I think that might be the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are really good points. I triggered an avalanche with 21 tracks on it one time on a slope. So yeah, don't
Yeah.
trust tracks. And the question that I ask every day, well, there's two. One is, has there been any recent avalanche activity, right? So maintain curiosity about recent avalanche activity. And as backcountry skiers and riders, we are avalanche avoiders. We are not the patrol going to look for avalanches. So if I see avalanches, I want to know what aspect and elevation they are, because I don't want to be in that same area. So figure out if there has been avalanche activity. And then the other question is, what has changed since yesterday? And if anything has changed, you need to go through, you should be asking more questions. Oh, we have had a lot of wind. Okay, so now are we concerned about wind slabs? Oh, the temperatures just got really warm. Okay, so does that mean our hazard's going to go even higher? So I think it is easy to go, oh, let's just go back to the usual. But the question in the morning is, what's changed and has there been avalanche activity? And hopefully that can at least put you in a bit of that beginner's mind.
Yeah, and that checklist kind of walks you through it. It's asking you questions like, hey, look at the temperatures over the last 24 hours. Hey, look at this new snow, look at the wind. All that is information that is telling you if there has been change or not.
Yeah, we built the checklist because most of us do most of those things most of the time. But all of us don't do all of those things all of the time. And so if you have a checklist, you're going to do all of those things all of the time.
Right.
That's the goal.
And for those that don't have all that time to do that, we have our avalanche center that we can pull up the website, look at that avalanche bulletin, and hopefully that sparks more questions and that encourages you to dive a little bit deeper into those resources that are available online to identify, why did the avalanche danger go from one thing to the next over the last 24 hours. And that it kind of goes off of what kind of is ringing from Sarah's talk, is that everyone should have an opinion and everyone should be seeking more information and asking questions and not just being the blind person going up and just skinning up a track because it's there and skiing down next to other tracks because they're there. You're there, you're making your own conscious decision to go up there and gathering information either on your own or through these Avalanche Center websites and building that big picture and making the decisions individually, but as a group, and having those good communication lines. Yeah. Well, if there's, we haven't seen any other questions pop up, but if anything else comes up in the next minute or so, but Sarah, we really appreciate your time getting on Zoom meetings with us and chatting with the folks tonight. And we've got this recorded. We're going to post it to the Peter and Ingalls Avalanche Education website and the Mountain Club website, Telluride Mountain Club website. And so we really appreciate your time and all your efforts over the years as well. We really appreciate all your knowledge and effort towards avalanche safety and having a good day.
Thank you. Yeah. And thanks for having me. And thank you for putting these on. I think it's a great community event and a great way to continue to learn as a community. So, and thank you guys for all your hard work.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, if there's anything else, John, you have anything else to add?
No, just thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks to the sponsors of the Pie Fund, the Telluride Mountain Club and the San Miguel Search and Rescue and Telski and Jagged Edge and all of you guys for doing this. And when's the next one?
TBD.
Yeah, it sounds like it's to be determined, but we'll probably have another one before the end of the season. I guess, last 2 cents, talking about just message fatigue and everyone being tired. Well, we just flipped the calendar into March. And so we've got spring weather coming ahead, hopefully, but winter's still probably holding on for a while too. And so not letting anyone's guards down and keeping our attention to the snow and the snowpack and all the changes that are happening down here. It's looking, over the last couple of weeks, we are trending towards a little more stability, so that's great. But there's still a lot of uncertainty out there, and so wide margins are still kind of prevalent. So keep reading that forecast. Pitching for the CAIC. If anyone sees or has any observations, just adding that information to the CAIC database, because those forecasters are trying to cover a large amount of ground, and so we are all the eyes and ears and communicators to them to help them build the better forecast for our community. So please, any information is great. I always say a picture is 1,000 words, but a video is 10,000 words. So doing anything, sending information, and being safe and making good decisions.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sarah, you got a lot of thank yous
See you
on the
guys.
chat. Yeah,
Awesome.
we appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. We really appreciate it, and look for any new updates on the next Avi chat before the end of the season. And let's enjoy March and be safe. Cheers, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.